So this section, Monroe's Presidency and Everyday Life, deals with the aftermath of the War of 1812 and a new emergence of American ideas, culture, identity, etc. So when we last left off, we had just signed the Treaty of Ghent to end the War of 1812. And like John Quincy Adams said, basically nothing happened. Everything went back to the way it was before the war. In a lot of ways, this was a very inconsequential war. Now, that being said, there are two huge takeaways from the War of 1812. One of them is we now have a new era of American heroes. We've moved past the founding fathers. James Monroe, who we'll talk about today, is the final founding father to serve as president. And the War of 1812 is largely responsible for essentially introducing the American people to this next generation of American heroes and politicians. The other thing that this war does is it alienates us from Great Britain and British culture. And as a result, we see an emergence of American culture. We see an emergence of an American identity that is separate from Great Britain. And that's what this section is really going to deal with, specifically the era of good feelings. And we're also going to look at some art, architecture, culture, etc. So let's first start with our new presidents. The War of 1812 ends in 1814 during the second term of James Madison. James Madison is reelected in 1812. And just like Jefferson, just like Washington, he decides to retire after 2 terms. He follows that precedent that the president should only serve 2 terms. And in 1816, James Monroe is tapped to replace James Madison. James Monroe was a good friend of James Madison. They had previously run against each other for senator. And in this situation, James Madison beat James Monroe. But while they had a political rivalry, they were still very close friends. And James Monroe, he is the Secretary of State under James Madison, and he is also from Virginia. This time period is known as the Virginia Dynasty, because if you've been keeping track of where the presidents are coming from, our first president, Washington, he's from Virginia. Our second president, Adams, is from Massachusetts, but our third, fourth, and now fifth president are all wealthy landowners from Virginia. So by this point, Jefferson, Monroe, and Madison, in the right order, Jefferson, Madison, and Monroe were seen as this political dynasty. And a lot of Americans were very upset with the idea that one state kept choosing, or the American people kept choosing a president from one state. But at the same time, Jefferson, Madison, and Monroe were doing a fantastic job. And they had guided us through the War of 1812. They had purchased the Louisiana Territory, and the idea was, and the thought was, that James Monroe would essentially be a continuation of the successes of Madison and Jefferson before him. So in 1816, as you can see on the map on the top right, Monroe is going to win this election handily, 183 electoral votes to Rufus King's 34. Rufus King will later serve as a vice president, but at this time period, he's part of the Federalist Party. And as we've been talking about recently, the Federalist Party is dying. As you can see, they only win the states of Massachusetts, Connecticut, and Delaware. They are mostly powerful in the North, especially Massachusetts in that New England area, which is why they're able to pick up a couple states. But for the most part, the Democratic Republicans are completely dominating the political landscape. Now, here's something interesting. Monroe helps create a new sense of national unity with our country. He's seen as one of our best presidents simply because everything he does while as president is received positively. He is president during a time period we call the era of good feelings. Now, that's a little bit incorrect in terms of like how it frames this time period. The era of good feelings is on one hand, exactly what it sounds like, an era of good feelings. There's peace, the country is prospering, things are going very, very well for Americans. On the other hand, it does mask and hide a lot of tensions that are simmering right below the surface. And what I mean is, over the past 10 or 15 years, as the Federalist Party has been losing power, the Democratic-Republican Party has been evolving. It's very common in American history that when one party loses power, the other party starts to become more diverse. just starts to change its views a little bit. And interestingly, something that we see happen starting during Jefferson's presidency and continuing into James Madison's presidency is the adoption of Federalist measures by the Democratic Republicans. That would be like if, for example, today, when Donald Trump takes office in January of 2025, if all of a sudden he started adopting certain Democrat policies and he started shaping the Republican Party in a way that it sort of absorbed and became, in a lot of ways, the Democrat Party. That would feel kind of weird to a lot of Republicans. And that's essentially what happens here. What happens is by 1816, the Democratic Republican Party has essentially become the Federalist Party. What I mean is all the things, trade, tariffs, central banking, strong federal power, all that stuff that used to be like the Federalist Party's situation, their beliefs, etc., that has now become the central platform, the core tenets of the Democratic Republicans. And what ends up happening is you start to see an internal split in the Democratic Republican Party. I mentioned previously that a nickname that the Democratic Republicans had was the Republicans. And what happens during this time period is you actually see a split where that nickname, the Republicans, the people who refer to themselves as the old Republicans are the ones who hold on to the original beliefs of the party, where they start nicknaming this sort of new version of the party the Democrats. And eventually, this will become the Democratic Party that exists today, but we're not quite there yet. We're still in the party, or in the part of American history where the party is known as the Democratic Republicans. But there is some infighting at the time period. So that's one thing that I wanted to kind of take an aside and make a note of. This seemingly unified party is not as unified as it looks like. That being said, James Monroe does a fantastic job as president, and by 1820, no candidate is pushed against him. By 1820, the Federalist Party has died. There is no Federalist Party anymore. Not really. Like, are there still people who call themselves Federalists? Yeah, absolutely. But there is no national Federalist Party anymore. It's been 16 years since Hamilton's death. It's been almost 20 years since a Federalist president. It is not a party that has any real power in American politics by 1820. And as a result of this, James Monroe basically runs unopposed. Now, you'll notice that he doesn't win every single electoral vote. He wins 231 to 1. Now, the reason that one man votes for John Quincy Adams, which is John Adams' son, in the Electoral College, is because he didn't believe that James Monroe deserved to win unanimously. He wanted to keep that distinction for George Washington, the only president who has won with 100% of the electoral votes. So James Monroe has the distinction of being the largest landslide victory in which he did not win all the votes. He literally won every single vote but one. No other presidential election has ever been this close. Sorry, not this close. Has ever been this much of a landslide, has ever been this far from it being an even close race. So we now have a new president, or we have our new president, right? James Monroe. He's elected in 1816. He does a great job during his first term, and he's reelected in 1820. And what we're going to talk about during this section is those 8 years, 1816 to 1824, the 8 years, or rather 1817 to 1825, the 8 years of James Monroe's presidency. Now, like I said, this is known as the era of good feelings. But that's a little bit of a misnomer because underneath the surface, I mentioned tension is starting to bubble up. And this tension is known as sectionalism. Now, sectionalism has a word you've all heard of before, section, right? A part of. And the idea of sectionalism is that within the Democratic Republican Party, there are different sections of the country. And different sections of the country, or different parts of the country, believe different things, have different values, have different needs, right? It makes a ton of sense. We in California are very different from someone on the East Coast, or in the Midwest, or in the South. So the same way that people in the Western territories are different from the Northern territories, Southern territories, etc., we start to see differences emerge within the Democratic Republican Party. And 3 congressmen are going to play key roles in sectionalism. John C. Calhoun, who was going to be a future vice president, Daniel Webster, and Henry Clay. So let's look at our first one. Our first one is John C. Calhoun. John C. Calhoun is a representative from South Carolina, which places him in the South. He's the leader of the southern section within the Democratic Republican Party. He's a fan of the War of 1812. He is a staunch defender of slavery, and he's going to push back against expanding power of the federal government. So he's what we would consider an old Republican, or someone who holds the original views of the Democratic Republican Party. He's not a fan of the Democratic Republicans adopting some of those Federalist views at the national level. He wants to go back to the original roots of the party that were formed by Jefferson's beliefs in the early 1800s, late 1790s. Our next person is Daniel Webster. Daniel Webster is a representative from New Hampshire, which means he is representing the North. He is opposed to the War of 1812. He was related to or worked with a group of people who were pushing for a secession in the North because they were upset with how the War of 1812 was happening. Now, if you remember, that didn't go anywhere because the peace treaty was signed in the meantime. But for the most part, he still has a lot of those very similar beliefs. He's a Northerner. He's from New Hampshire. He's from New England. They are vehemently anti-slavery. He believes slavery is evil, and he is going to push for abolition. Now, he also wants to expand federal power. He also wants to expand the federal government's ability to do what is necessary to meet the needs of its people. Daniel Webster, if he had lived 20, 30 years before, or if he had been a representative 20, 30 years before, he would have identified with the Federalist Party. So he is part of this new era of Democratic Republicans where they have started to embrace what the Federalists believed in. He would have been called a Democrat by his political opponents, even though he identified as a Democratic Republican. Our third person is Henry Clay. We've talked about Henry Clay before. He was one of the original war hawks in the War of 1812. He's from Kentucky. Now, Kentucky, it sounds weird because they're an eastern state today, but at that time period, Kentucky was the West. Kentucky was the frontier. He's a big fan of the War of 1812. Like I said, he's one of the original war hawks. And he, once again, supports a strong central government. Henry Clay, just like Daniel Webster, is going to be more in line with the Federalist view than the original Democratic Republican view, which is why he, just like Daniel Webster, would have been called a Democrat. Very negative. That was like a negative nickname at the time period. People said like, oh, you're a Democrat. You're not a true old Republican. You're not a true Democratic Republican. You are the ones who are changing our party, making it worse by adopting the Federalist ideas from 20 years ago. So those were our three people, Clay, Webster, and Calhoun. They're sort of going to be our main characters, so to speak, in this new era of American government. I mentioned back with the slide in which we elected James Monroe that he is the final founding father to serve as president. Webster, Calhoun, and Clay are part of this new generation of Americans who sort of cut their teeth with the War of 1812 and came to prominence during this new era of American history. All right, go ahead and do the knowledge check real quick. What position does Webster share with Clay? So the War of 1812 has ended. Let's talk about the economy. Now, back in 1811, right before the war starts, the first bank of the United States, its charter runs out. Its charter is essentially the form or the registration papers that allows the bank to operate. And because the first bank charter runs out, the economy begins to suffer now that we no longer have this central banking system to help us out, to help regulate the economy. So by 1816, the second bank of the United States is chartered. This once again stabilizes the economy and starts to help businesses grow. By this point, most politicians in the United States have recognized the value of this bank, this financial system that Alexander Hamilton set up, and that it is necessary for our economy to continue functioning properly. Something else that we're going to start dealing with is trade. So the embargo on British goods, when we were not trading with Great Britain, both right before and during the war, this allowed American industry to develop. Makes sense, right? If, you can't import clothing from Great Britain, you're going to start making it in factories in America. If you can't import weapons, you're going to make them in America. What else? Furniture in America, cookingware in America, etc. So what happens is once we start trading with Britain again, once we start trading with foreign goods, right? Because foreign is from another country, domestic is from our country. Once trade with Great Britain begins, what the British start doing is they end up purposely lowering the prices of British cloth. Because they have purposely lowered these prices, they are taking a loss. They are selling things for less than it cost to create, but they're betting that by doing this, more people will buy British goods. And they are correct. British goods are cheaper than American goods. And as a result, many of these small companies, many of these factories that were expanding their production during the War of 1812, during the embargo and the boycott of British goods, they are unable to compete with cheaper British goods. And they are going to lose their businesses. Now, this is a bad thing for American manufacturing, right? Because if a business can't stay in business, if a business can't continue functioning, the people who work for that business, they're going to lose their jobs. And if those jobs are lost, then that's going to hurt the economy as a whole. So what does Congress do to alleviate this hardship? What does Congress do to kind of push back against Britain cheapening its cloth? Well, they're going to pass the tariff of 1816. This is going to make foreign goods more expensive. We talked about tariffs before in this class. What ends up happening is people who produce things, factory owners, factory workers, etc., they benefit from tariffs because their goods become cheaper than foreign goods. Now, if you're in the north, where most of the factories are, this is fantastic. Every time, we've talked about this before, we're talking about it now, we'll talk about it in the future. Every single time a tariff is passed on American soil during this era of American history, between now and the year 1900, roughly, tariffs are great for the North and bad for the South and the West as well. We've started to expand to the West. Just like the South, the West relies on British goods because they don't have the factories themselves. And for a lot of different reasons, British goods are more reliable and they are cheaper to import than they are to buy American goods. So and also, especially if you're in the South and the West and you're farming, a lot of heavy farm equipment is not yet created in the North. They're not going to start making that until about the 1850s, 1860s. Prior to that time period, most of the farm goods that farming communities needed were created in Europe, specifically in Great Britain. So this tariff is going to be great for the North, but it's going to be very bad for the South. The South is going to be incredibly angry because they now have to pay more for British goods. Now, at the same time that we have this tariff being passed, at the same time that we are starting to recover our economy with the new Bank of the United States, the second Bank of the United States, because it's the second charter, we are going to see the emergence of a new system. This is Henry Clay's American system. And his American system is designed, it's an economic system. It's the way to help our economy, to help the American people create goods, produce goods. Now, this system was ideally created to fight sectionalism, essentially to create harmony between the North, the West, and the South. The idea was high tariffs would help northern industry, meaning the North would be able to create goods that were cheaper than foreign competitors. That would help their factories expand. That would help their businesses expand. That would help them hire more people, open more factories. Overall, great for the North. Now, at the same time that these high tariffs were enacted, the North would start actually producing the things that the South and the West needed. Those heavy farming machinery that I talked about earlier, or the things that the South and the West had been importing from Britain, the North would meet their needs. Now, the benefit of doing that means that the South and the West are no longer hurt by tariffs as much. In addition, because the South and the West can now buy things from the North, that would increase how much money the North is making, which lets them buy goods from the South and the West, increasing profit for everybody. The idea is the North makes the stuff we need, the South and the West buys that stuff, and the money they're spending to buy that stuff benefits the North. It's a circle. It's a circle of, economic benefits. And the hope is that these tariffs that we are passing, because some stuff will continue to be imported from other countries, that revenue, that income that we make from tariffs, the US government, we can use that to create roads, bridges, and canals. We can make roads to make trade and travel easier. Same with bridges, same with canals. This ideally would help develop our nation and benefit people in the North, the South, and the West, creating a system in which everyone relies on everyone else. And ideally, that would help remove some of the rivalries and differences that we have between the different parts of our nation. We have another quick knowledge check. Why did many states in the North, in the South and West, oppose the tariff of 1816? Why did they dislike the tariff when the North was 100% gung-ho, let's do it? So at the same time that we are dealing with the American system and tariffs and sectionalism, we also have another major Supreme Court case. This is our second landmark case. Our first one was Marbury v. Madison, that establishes the idea of judicial review, where the court can rule on laws. Thumbs up, laws are good, keep them. Thumbs down, unconstitutional laws, change them or remove them. We also have the Supreme Court case of McCulloch v. Maryland. Now, here's some background. In 1819, Maryland, the state of Maryland, tries to tax the Bank of the United States to drive it out of the state. Not every state in the United States likes the Bank of the United States. Not all of them like having this federal bank in their states. And Maryland's goal is that they are going to heavily tax the Bank of the United States, like the physical building, the version of the bank that exists in Maryland. Their hope is by taxing it to this insane degree, it will force the bank out of business and it will force it to leave the states. Now, one of the bank cashiers, one of the men who works at the Bank of the United States, his name is James McCulloch in McCulloch v. Maryland. That's where we get the McCulloch part from. He is the bank cashier. He's going to refuse to pay this tax, and he is going to sue the state of Maryland, hence the name McCulloch v. Maryland. And this is going to start in the local district courts. Eventually, it will make its way all the way up to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court is ultimately going to rule that states have no rights to interfere with federal institutions within their borders. This ruling ultimately is going to expand federal power and further define the necessary and proper clause of the Constitution. All right, so there's a lot of things there. So I'm going to give an example to hopefully make this make more sense. So just south of us, there's a giant military base. It's Camp Pendleton. It's a Marine Corps base. They have tons of stuff there. It's like if you drive down to San Diego, it's when you're going along the I-5, you can see the base to your left and to your right. You can see some of the buildings are like, they have like raids and practice and training and all that fun stuff, right? That's a giant military base. California does not own that military base. The military does. The military is part of the federal government. Camp Pendleton is a federal institution. It is a literal organization run by the federal government, a military camp run by the federal government. According to McCulloch v. Maryland, the state of California cannot mess with Camp Pendleton. Governor Gavin Newsom can't just be like, hey guys, pack it up, get out of here, I want to build houses here. He can't just say, hey, you have to pay an extra fee to continue using this base. He can't send in California National Guard to mess with the Marine Corps. That is a federal piece of land. That is a federal institution. They operate outside of the typical laws and regulations that exist for places in California. That's what McCulloch v. Maryland decides. Things like banks, like federal banks, things like post offices, things like military institutions like Camp Pendleton, those cannot be messed with by the state governments. Only the federal government can decide what to do with those things. So that's going to expand federal power, right? Because the federal government has control over its own stuff inside of these states. Now, part 2 of this talks about the necessary and proper clause. That's that elastic clause we talked about back in Unit 2. That's the idea that the federal government can expand its power when necessary. Congress can make any laws that are necessary and proper. We talked about that when it came to like seatbelts and other safety regulations when it has to do with cars. The idea that Congress can read between the lines of the Constitution when it is deemed necessary and proper. So that is McCulloch v. Maryland. It is decided during the first term of James Monroe. And it rules, essentially, that federal stuff within the states can't be messed with by the states. There's another case as well, Gibbons v. Ogden, that happens near the tail end of James Monroe's second term. Now, the background for this one is that Robert Fulton's steamboat company has a monopoly over travel between New York and New Jersey. Now, when it means monopoly, it's like the board game, right? A monopoly is when you control everything of that trade. So, like, for example, if I am the only person that makes a certain type of cell phone, or if I am the only person that makes an electric car, and I am the only one who's allowed to make an electric car or a cell phone or something else, I have a monopoly over that thing. So in this situation, Robert Fulton, he's just some guy living in New York, and he has a steamboat company. Think like the steamboats at Disneyland, for example, the Mark Twain one that hangs around during Adventureland and that whole fun stuff. Robert Fulton, he has a monopoly, meaning he's the only guy, only his company can travel between New York and New Jersey. Now, a man named Gibbons, he's probably the district attorney or like the main lawyer for New York or New Jersey. He's going to sue Ogden, who is most likely another district attorney or the defendant in this case. Now, this court case essentially is going to argue, hey, Robert Fulton is not allowed to have a monopoly. Like, we don't like this situation. That's not fair. Maybe I've got a steamboat company. Maybe Gibbons is a guy who owns a steamboat company. Maybe Ogden's a guy who owns a steamboat company. And I don't know them off the top of my head. I didn't look this one up for this case. But regardless, anyone else who owns a steamboat company, they're not allowed to travel between New York and New Jersey and like send people or send goods or whatever. Robert Fulton is the only one who's allowed, according to the state of New York. And some people didn't think that was fair. So they sued the government and they said, hey, you can't do this. And they sued the government to hopefully win. Eventually, this case goes all the way to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court rules that only the federal government can regulate interstate commerce. New York can regulate trade within its own borders. So what does that mean? That means that Robert Fulton, he totally could have a monopoly. That's totally fine, as long as that monopoly stays in New York. So like, for example, maybe he has a monopoly over travel between Manhattan and Long Island, two different islands in New York. That's totally cool, according to Gibbons v. Ogden. That's totally fine. It's inside New York. New York's in charge. The problem is when you involve New Jersey, the next door state. Robert Fulton's situation, his monopoly, because he had control over trade between states, that's where New York gets in trouble. Because at that point, you're basically telling New Jersey what to do. And New York is not allowed to tell New Jersey what to do as much as it would like to. Only the federal governments can tell New York and New Jersey what to do with trade. So Congress, the president, whoever, they could give Robert Fulton a monopoly over New York, New Jersey travel. But New York cannot, and New Jersey cannot. They are only in charge of stuff inside their state. That's the idea of Gibbons versus Ogden. So this is once again giving the federal government more power over the states. Here's another case. Trustees of Dartmouth College v. Woodward. Dartmouth College is one of the Ivy Leagues on the East Coast. Now, Dartmouth College has a board of trustees. This is just a fancy term for the people, the organization, the group of people who run the college. Now, the president of Dartmouth College was removed by the board of trustees. And the state of New Hampshire, where Dartmouth is located, they didn't like this. They didn't want this the board of trustees, to be a private organization. Dartmouth is a private college. So what does New Hampshire try to do? It tries to force the college to become a public state school, meaning it would be run by the government, something like UCLA, UCSD, UCI, etc. Those are public schools. New Hampshire tried to force Dartmouth to become a public school, which would allow the governor to appoint the trustees. So, for example, the trustees of the University of California, that's chosen by the governor whenever there's an opening. Cal States, California state colleges, those are chosen by the governor. But if you go to a private school like USC or Chapman or Loyola, for example, the board of trustees is chosen by the college. They're a private school, they can choose their own leadership. New Hampshire in this situation is trying to make the college become public so they can choose the leadership. Now, what is ultimately decided is that the Contract Protection Clause of the Constitution applies to both public and private corporations. This decision keeps states from interfering with private corporations. Now, what does this mean? This means that in our Constitution, there's something called the Contract Protection Clause. Now, a contract is something that two people sign. If I sign a contract saying like, hey, I'm going to do this, like for example, the lease on my apartment, I agree that I'm going to pay a certain amount of money on a certain day for a certain amount of months, right? Like that's a contract. I sign it, the person who owns my apartment, they sign it, we're good to go. That contract is protected by the Constitution. And according to Dartmouth College v. Woodward, that applies to public contracts in public corporations, like the military or the post office or something like that, police stations, schools, whatever. It also applies to private corporations, private businesses, private colleges, etc. Now, this once again is keeping states from interfering with private corporations. It's making sure that states do not overpower or bully or do whatever they want with these private companies. This is once again the federal government exercising its power over the states to protect individual rights. We have a quick knowledge check. How does the McCulloch v. Maryland decision increase federal power? All right, so that is what happens in terms of domestic policy, what's happening at home with James Monroe's presidency. Now we're going to shift to foreign policy, or what's going on in the world. And a huge thing happens during President Monroe's presidency, during his second term specifically, and that is what happens during his first and mostly his second, and that is Spain basically loses all of its colonies. Take a look at this map on the right. Everything in green, with the exception of Louisiana up here, is Spanish. We have the Viceroyalty of New Spain. We have what is today Nicaragua, Panama, Costa Rica, etc. We have New Granada. We have Rio de la Plata, which is like Uruguay, Paraguay, Argentina, etc. We have Peru, and then what is today Chile, which is also part of Peru back then, right? So we have all these different viceroyalties, all these different colonies owned by Spain. And obviously purple is Portugal, and then you can see us up here, right? It's British territory because we're talking, 1780. This is during the Revolution, right? So we've declared independence, but it's not until 1783 that this would change on the map to the United States of America. So Spain owns a lot of stuff, right? Spain is probably the most powerful colonial nation in the world, or colonial power in the world, up until the 1800s. Now, what happens is two things. Number one, the Spanish are not very good rulers of their colonies. They do not treat the people well. They do not give them the opportunity to thrive. They don't really care about how their colonies are doing. What Spain cares about is money, specifically gold and silver. So all they did was really set up these colonies to mine gold and silver and abuse. And as a result, all they care about is this gold and silver, which results in them abusing the people. Most people have no say in government, even if you're wealthy, even if you are someone who comes from Spain, who are known as the Peninsulares, the people of the peninsula. Even if you came from the Spanish peninsula, the Iberian Peninsula, to this region, you were treated terribly by the Spanish government. And if you were an American Indian, someone who was born in this region or descended from somebody born in this region, you were kept in perpetual debt. You owed money permanently. There was no way to pay it all off. And this whole mistreatment keeps building and building and building. And now something else that's happening at this time period is Spain has joined Napoleon. And by joined, I mean Napoleon's conquered them, placed his brother in charge, and then they've been forced to join him. And while Napoleon's doing his whole try to take over the continent of Europe, Spain is sort of neglecting its territories, its colonies, even further. And as a result, we start seeing a very widespread independence movement in Latin America. The first nation we're going to talk about is Mexico. In 1810, so this is actually pre-War of 1812, Miguel Hidalgo, he is a Mexican priest. He's going to first call for Mexican independence. He and his supporters are going to start fighting for independence, but unfortunately Hidalgo was captured and executed in 1811, so they lose their leader. But they don't lose hope, they don't give up. Jose Morelos is going to take charge, but he's not super popular. He doesn't have some good ideas, doesn't have some good policies with the wealthy Creoles, who are the mixed Spanish and indigenous people, and he's also going to be captured and killed. So 0 for 2 so far in terms of leaders for your independence movement. However, by 1821, revolutionary forces led by those Creoles that we just talked about, they are going to win control of Mexico. Mexico is going to declare its independence and officially be independent in 1821. So they're no longer New Spain. We now have a new next door neighbor. Their name is Mexico. And they control what is modern day Mexico, but also California, New Mexico, Arizona, Utah, a little bit of Colorado, and Texas. So they are massive. They're going to be our massive, brand new next door neighbor that we're going to be buddies with for at least a little bit, a decade or two. Then we won't be buddies because we'll steal some land after going to war with them. But for now, we've got a new buddy next door. Their name is Mexico. At the same time, we also have Gran Colombia. In 1819, Simón Bolívar, he's going to lead Venezuelan rebel forces against the Spanish. He's going to defeat them in the Andes Mountains. The Andes Mountains range is a mountain range that goes from north to south along the left side of South America. He is going to then become president of the Independent Republic of Gran Colombia. That is the modern-day nations of Venezuela, Colombia, Ecuador, and Panama. These 4 nations will eventually split up, but at least for now, they are part of Gran Colombia, which is like Grand Colombia, giant Colombia. We also have Argentina. Argentina, Chile, and Peru are going to gain independence. They are all going to gain independence as a result of this gentleman on the top right. This is Jose de San Martin. In 1816, he's going to lead his home nation of Argentina to freedom. And then he is going to hop over to Chile and Peru, and he is going to help give them independence as well. By 1821, Central America, Nicaragua, Panama, Costa Rica, they're also going to declare independence from Spain. So in a period of about 10 years, 1811, 1821, Spain pretty much loses all of its colonies in Central and South America. And yeah, there we go. Like I said, by 1825, not 1821, Spain's going to lose basically all of its Latin American colonies except for Puerto Rico and Cuba. Puerto Rico and Cuba, they're going to stay Spanish colonies until we take them from Spain in the Spanish-American War in 1897 to roughly 1901. It's in that 4-year time period. I don't remember the exact year off the top of my head, but roughly that is when the Spanish-American War is, and that's when they're going to lose their last Latin American colonies. But with the exception of those 2 nations, by 1825, about 15 years-ish after the whole Mexican independence movement begins, Spain is going to lose everything else. And now here's where we come in. Now, not only is this important because, this is our backyard in the sense that these are our next door neighbors. These are the people who hang out near us, right? The nations that are nearby. But a lot of these nations, the reason they declare independence is because they are inspired by the United States. So not only does the American independence movement, not only does our Revolutionary War inspire France with their revolution, not only does it inspire Haiti with the Haitian Revolution, the slave revolt we talked about last week, it also is going to inspire all these revolutionary independence movements in Latin America as well. Not only does our independence movement inspire theirs, but our Constitution, our style of Republican governments, Republican like republic, like where we elect our leaders, they are also going to copy our constitutional republic. They're also going to copy a lot of our Constitution, and they are going to use that as a template for their own governments. So in a lot of ways, we are seen as sort of like the big brother of a lot of these nations. We are the templates or the original version of independence that they looked at, liked, and emulated or copied themselves. Quick knowledge check. What characteristics do the newly independent South American nations share with the United States? So that being said, I mentioned that all of Spain's colonies are basically gone at this point by 1825, right? They lose Mexico, they lose Argentina, they lose Gran Colombia, etc. There's one that we haven't talked about yet, and that is Florida. So Florida is still part of Spain at this point, both East Florida and West Florida. Now, East Florida is what we know as Florida today, the actual state. West Florida is the part of Mississippi and Alabama that touches the coast of the Gulf of Mexico. Now, at this point, Spain doesn't really do much with Florida. Spain kind of ignores Florida. It's a swamp. I mean, if you've ever been to Florida today, you'll know it's fairly swampy. Obviously, we've put gravel and asphalt and cities and stuff in Florida, so it's not a literal swamp today. But back then, it's a lot of swampland, a lot of bogs. It's not great. It's not a great place to live. And that's why the Spanish haven't really done much with Florida. So for the most part, two groups of people live in Florida. Escaped slaves who have escaped from slavery within the United States and then fled to Florida because it's a swamp and it's hard to find people in a swamp. Also, it's not America. And American Indians who have been forced out of their ancestral homes in America as well. Last week, we talked about the Miami. The Miami are from the Ohio River Valley region originally. But because of, the Battle of Tippecanoe and all the other stuff we're doing with American Indians prior to 1815, they are forced out of Ohio, and they eventually make their way to Florida, hence why Miami, Florida is in Florida today. So Florida is a haven for escaped slaves and a hiding place for Creek and Seminole tribes who occasionally are going to come up into Georgia, which is the state right next to Florida today, and they are going to raid and attack white settlements and plantations in Georgia. So the Spanish, for the most part, they're kind of just vibing. They're not really doing much with Florida. They don't really care that people who are not Spanish are hanging out in Florida. They're just doing their own thing, and they're letting these people hang out and do their thing in Florida. But Andrew Jackson, if you remember him from the War of 1812, General Andrew Jackson is not happy with this. We'll get into Andrew Jackson a lot more when I talk about him as presidents, but Andrew Jackson hates a couple of different things. And one of the main things that Andrew Jackson hates, or one of the main two things that Andrew Jackson hates, are black people and American Indians. And I know that sounds hyperbolistic or insane, but literally that's what he hates slaves. So he hates black slaves and he hates American Indians. He will do whatever it takes to get rid of them, even if that means literally killing them, men, women, and children. So he's absolutely pissed that these people are hiding in Florida and escaping justice from America. Remember, these are American Indian tribes who are coming and raiding Georgia, and that's what's really making Andrew Jackson mad. These escaped slaves, they are considered property by the American people, and they have escaped and made their way into Florida. So are these people trying to find a better life in Florida? Yes, absolutely. And by today's standards, are they doing the right thing by, trying to escape Americans who are treating them poorly? 100%. But that's not how Andrew Jackson sees it. Andrew Jackson sees it as escaped property and people who have been attacking Americans. That's how he sees it. And that's why he hates these people so much, or that's part of the reason why he hates these people so much. We'll get into it a lot more later in Unit 4. So Andrew Jackson is incredibly angry at Spain, and he demands that they go into their own territory and destroy a settlement with over 1,000 escaped slaves and American Indian tribes who are just trying to exist. Now, the Spanish governor of Florida is going to refuse. It's not his problem. They're not hurting anyone, or at least they're not hurting anyone that he cares about, right? He's not a huge fan of America at this time period. And as a result of this, Andrew Jackson ends up leading a military force into Spanish Florida, and he destroys the fort himself. He murders men, women, and children, American Indians, escaped slaves. It doesn't matter. He's incredibly angry at them. He either tries to recapture the slaves that live there, or if they're not willing to go willingly or peacefully, he is going to kill them. Now, on one hand, this is 100% in line with the character of Andrew Jackson, right? He is trying to get justice for Americans, and that's admirable, right? Getting justice for people. On the other hand, what's not so admirable is him killing men, women, and children to get that justice. Also, kind of a big issue that he's just done, he's just invaded Spain. And usually when you invade another nation, that is a cause for war. So Andrew Jackson's massively screwed up here by essentially invading another nation's territory. And luckily for us, this does not result in a war with Spain, but it very nearly could have. So, what happens as a result? Well, because Andrew Jackson goes into Spain to get those escaped slaves and ends up murdering a bunch of people, he does this in like the early 18 teens, like 1814, 1815, something like that. He once again does it in 1818. He invades in Florida again for much the similar reason, for many of the same reasons: escaped slaves, American Indian tribes, etc. They're not good reasons, like by today's standards. They might have been good reasons for him or the standards of the time, but like for the most part, you don't invade another country's territory. That's not cool. That's like, it's not a thing you're supposed to do. It can very likely result in war. Now, remember, by 1818, Spain is losing control of all of its colonies. It's not going well. Things are not going well for Spain. And they realize that they do not have the ability to fight back against Jackson, who's probably just going to keep invading over and over and over again. So they start peace talks. They start figuring out how we can peacefully resolve this without us going to war with Spain, Spain going to war with us, this becoming a whole kerfuffle, shenanigans. Like, we don't want to deal with this, right? They don't want to deal with it. We don't want to deal with it. Let's just have some sort of peace talk. So what happens is Secretary of State John Quincy Adams, who is the son of John Adams, and Spain's foreign minister Luis de Onis, they're going to agree to a treaty. This is known as the Adams-Onis Treaty. And the United States is going to buy Florida for $5 million. And this is going to go into effect in 1821. So in 1821, we are going to acquire Florida. It is very soon going to become a territory and eventually will become a state. And this becomes the resolution to Jackson not wanting to have to deal with American Indians and escaped slaves escaping or leaving the country to hang out in Spanish Florida. This solves that issue for us, because now Andrew Jackson or the military or whoever can just send people in. We can settle, colonize the region, and ensure that it cannot be used as a place for these people to hide out any further. Now, are they just trying to get, freedom for themselves and escape a horrible life that is slavery? Yeah, absolutely. But by the standards of the time, unfortunately, that was seen as breaking the law, not allowed, and therefore Jackson and other military officers are going to go in and get them out or get them back. So, anyways, 1821, the Adams-Onis Treaty is passed and approved, and we now own Florida. Quick knowledge check. What is the result of the Adams-Onis Treaty? All right, so this has all been building to something. Spain losing its colonies, independence movements all over Central and South America. And what this is building toward is the Monroe Doctrine. Now, every time a president has a sort of overarching policy or overarching belief or an action that they take or a piece of legislation they pass, it sometimes gets the term doctrine. Now, we're going to talk about the Monroe Doctrine today. The most recent one in American history was the Bush Doctrine, which is the way that President George W. Bush and the United States, by extension, dealt with the War on Terror. There's the Reagan Doctrine. There's the Truman Doctrine. A number of high-profile presidents have come up with wide foreign policy ideas that later become known as doctrines. And today we're going to talk about the first one, the Monroe Doctrine. So, in a word, or essentially, what the Monroe Doctrine does is it defends independence. Now, the Monroe Doctrine is written by Secretary of State John Quincy Adams. It's one of his greatest pieces of work, but obviously it's named after Monroe because Monroe is president at the time. So in 1823, what Monroe does is he issues a message to Congress spelling out a new foreign policy. The United States will not interfere in the affairs of Europe or its existing colonies. Basically, the United States is saying, hey, Europe, we're going to chill. We're not going to bug you. We're not going to bug your stuff. You can hang on to your stuff. We're not going to interfere with that. In exchange, Europe is warned not to attempt to regain control of the newly independent nations of South America. Now, what does that mean? Basically, Europe is allowed to just do its own thing with its current colonial possessions. The United States is going to be the protector, the big brother, the big buddy of all of these brand new independent nations in Central and South America. All these places that just declared independence from Spain, the United States is going to protect them. The United States is going to make sure that they stay independent and that they are not messed with. Now, that's a pretty bold proclamation for the United States to be saying. Because if you remember War of 1812, just before that, we don't really have the military or the Navy or like the power as a nation to really follow through on this message. This is a pretty bold message for us to be saying. We don't really have a shot at defending against a nation like France or Spain or Great Britain if they decide to mess with these newly independent nations. However, we have a new buddy because of the Treaty of Ghent, because of the end of the War of 1812, and that is Great Britain. Great Britain is on our side here. Great Britain signs on to the Monroe Doctrine. Great Britain basically tells the rest of Europe, hey, you should listen to the United States. You should not mess with these brand new independent nations because we and them are going to defend these brand new nations. And so here with this political cartoon, you can see sort of the Monroe Doctrine in action. The idea is on the left side, you have all the nations of Europe, right? So this is Spain here. They're all caricatures, right? So this is Spain here with their it's like the every once in a while they'll have like their like bullfighting or like the bull chase down the streets of Seville, for example. This is like the traditional garb that they would wear. This is Britain right here, the chubby guy with the red coat, right? This is France. The idea is he's short. They're making fun of Napoleon. This is most likely Prussia or another Central or Eastern European nation. And then this guy over here is Portugal. So these are all the major nations of Europe. You know what? This actually might be Russia and not Prussia. I don't know off the top of my head. But based off of the characterizations and like the styles of dress that people had at the time period, these are 5 major nations of Europe. And this obviously is us. This is Uncle Sam. Uncle Sam is a personification of America in the form of Uncle Sam, right? U.S. Uncle Sam. This is Uncle Sam defending the recently independent nations. Now, that being said, couple things here. Uncle Sam is seen as like the big, strong defender. These nations are very much seen as small, weak, unable to defend themselves. And the idea is that we will help them defend their own independence from the nations of Europe. Now, one thing I do want to mention, the Monroe Doctrine isn't actually, it's important and it's big and it's notable for this time period. But what's interesting is we don't actually weaponize the Monroe Doctrine to say like, hey, we're the boss of North and South America until the 1900s. We use the Monroe Doctrine a lot later in history as sort of a, hey guys, remember when we said stay out of this area, we're in charge? We use the Monroe Doctrine as an excuse to really dictate how Central and South America develops in the 1900s and early 2000s. So this right here is, it's a gesture of goodwill. This is ultimately is a good thing that we did. We are helping out our brand new next door neighbors while they're developing their nations, so they don't get like easily conquered by, you know, a European power that's more powerful. But at the same time, it also sows the seeds for some ways that we might interact with those nations and interfere with those nations positively or negatively in the future as well. We have another quick knowledge check. What is the purpose of the Monroe Doctrine? Now, this last section of 3.6 is talking about culture, life in the early republic. What is the culture of America like since the War of 1812, now that we are breaking away from Great Britain culturally and coming up with a new American version of U.S. culture, as opposed to a British version, which we just inherited from the British after we gained independence. So, for the most part, most Americans work on farms. That's going to be the case until about 1920 or so, when we start seeing more than half of Americans living in cities. At this time period, like I said, most Americans work on farms. We are going to start seeing young women moving to cities to work in the growing textile industry. It was not uncommon for a lot of women and girls when they were like 16, 17, 18, 19 years old to start moving out of their parents' house, moving off their parents' farm to a city where they would work in the textile industry, where they would work making clothing, yarn, etc. Now, at the same time, churches are the center of social life in America. At this time period, we're still a nation that is 95% Christian, specifically Protestant Christian. And as a result, churches were the easiest way to find community, to connect with the people that lived around you. Now, Protestant churches are the most common, like it says here, but there are Catholics, there are Jewish people, there are other religions as well, and they are allowed to worship at their synagogues or their Catholic churches, etc. And a lot of the churches that are built during this time period, a lot of them still exist today. So for example, this image here, this is Trinity Church in downtown New York City. This is actually the church where Alexander Hamilton and his wife and his father-in-law and his sister-in-law are buried. So if you ever go to New York, you can actually go to Trinity Church. It's completely free. You can go and you can see where one of our founding fathers was buried. A lot of these churches also exist in places like Philadelphia, Boston, etc. It's very common to see these churches still standing today. At the same time, we also see a change in education as well. Now, we're not quite to the point where public education exists yet. That's not going to happen until like the 1830s, 1840s. Prior to that, we had private schools. Now, sometimes these were grammar schools. Sometimes these were like more in line with what you guys might know as like elementary schools today. And in some cases, people were educated in their own houses. Wealthy Americans would typically have private tutors or au pairs, which were like women, like think like babysitters, but like full time, and they do like education and raising the children and supervising them. It's like a super intense babysitter, essentially. That was really only for the wealthy, though. And like I said, private schools, these were typically run, and they charged tuition that was very, very high. And this was typically run in larger cities for the wealthy and the elites. The way that most people learned how to read or learned literacy or learned how to be literate was the Bible. The Bible was often used to teach literacy. And here's why. If you are not a wealthy elite person, or a rich person, you probably don't have the money to buy your own books. You probably also don't have the money to become a member of a private library like wealthy Americans would. So chances are you're only going to have one or two books. And like I said, we are at this time period a very, very religious nation. So if you're only going to have one or two books, you're probably going to buy the Bible as one of them. And as a result, most people learn to read using the Bible. Now, at the same time, we also have an expansion of American art. Now, art is not just like paintings, it's also architecture as well. So we're going to see a ton of wealthy Americans pay to have their portraits painted. So a lot of the portraits and pictures of people that you've seen throughout these slideshows, those have been portraits that have been, excuse me, those have been portraits that have been painted during this time period. Now, a lot of these painters, a lot of these American painters, they're going to look to Europe for training style and themes, meaning they're going to go to Europe and be trained by classical European artists. Or they're going to try to emulate or copy European styles of... Excuse me. They're going to try to copy European styles of portraiture, European themes, and they're eventually going to blend those together to create a unique American style. Something else we're going to see is a new emergence of American architecture. Now, this is known as the federal style or federalism. The idea is it's going to take Greek architecture and it is going to combine it with modern architecture of the 1800s. So, for example, this is the Old State House in Boston, Massachusetts. This is their city hall. And as you can see, they have a dome like ancient Greece. They have pillars. They have pediments. They have a lot of classical architectural elements from Greek architecture. But At the same time, you're also seeing very modern arches, brickwork. You're also seeing like white limestone and marble. Now, white limestone and marble was both Greek, but also both modern 1800s as well. And so you're really seeing a combination of ancient styles and modern styles. And this becomes known as the federal style. If you ever go to Washington, D.C., or just look at pictures of places at Washington, D.C., you'll notice the Capitol building, the Supreme Courts, the White House, most of the buildings in Washington, D.C., and most state capitals, like the one we have in Sacramento, they use federal style. And a lot of this is a result of these buildings being built in this era of American history. At the same time, we also have an emergence of American music. Among white Americans, British music is incredibly popular. This is pre-recording, so like there is no gramophone, there is no CDs, obviously there's no streaming, there's no Spotify. All music was performed live. There was no way to record it. So if you were a wealthy American, you might go to a place like the opera, or you might go to a musical, or you might go to a performance or a concert hall, and you might listen to an orchestra play live or a person sing live. If you were not a wealthy American, you might perform music for your friends and family. You might have kids who learn instruments and perform. You might have a local band, or you might have your local choir that you listen to at church. Now, at the same time, we also have a unique identity being created for African Americans in America as well. This is among both the enslaved and the free population, but mostly among the enslaved population. They're going to sing spirituals. Spirituals they're usually pretty religious based. They're usually using a lot of religious undertones and using a lot of religious wording and verbiage and iconography. And these spirituals were typically sung while they were working in the fields, but they were also sung in homes and in churches. And these African American spirituals are eventually going to emerge into a lot of modern music that we have today. Things like jazz, things like reggae, R&B, rap, soul, hip hop. A lot of those genres are going to trace their roots back to this time period, specifically African American spirituals. So in a lot of ways, a lot of unique musical genres created in America have a lot of roots in Black Americans, which is really, really cool. Now, at the same time, we also have American literature. We're going to see the first American books being published. 1789, William Hill Brown is going to publish the first American novel, The Power of Symphony. But the one that you might be more familiar with is Washington Irving's works. He has one called The Sketchbook, and it has a number of short stories, things like The Legend of Sleepy Hollow with the Headless Horseman, things like Rip Van Winkle. A lot of early American folklore, early American children's stories are going to be published during this time. Quick knowledge check. Why do you think folk art of the early Republic used patriotic images? I didn't really mention it too much during the slides, but one of the things that art is really going to focus on during this time period is patriotism, pride for your country, love of your country. Why would folk art prioritize that?